Welcome to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws, the podcast that cuts through the rubbish to explore the world of neurodiversity. I'm your host, Nick King.
And I'm your host, Kate Fox. And together we're here to explore, understand, and celebrate being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. From ADHD and autism to dyslexia and other quirky brains, we talk about it all.
And go off on tangents. So, whether you're neurodivergent, love someone who is, or you're just curious about neurodivergent minds, you are in the right place.
Let's get ready to juggle some words and maybe even a few chainsaws, metaphorically, of course.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws. This session, we're going to discuss this concept around sort of late diagnosed adults. And quite often I felt, and I hear within our community, this idea that we're not suffering enough for a diagnosis. This idea that it's not that bad for me. I don't look like that autistic person. That autistic person has clearly very high support needs. That isn't what I look like. So they feel sort of like maybe people might laugh off if they went to seek a diagnosis, or maybe they would feel like people might be dismissive of them. So we're gonna explore this concept of suffering, and when is it enough suffering for you to think that you might, need accommodations, that you might need a diagnosis, that you might be thinking along those lines.
And actually, it feels so resonant for me. I know I certainly remember at some point having thought I was autistic from about 2005 onwards, but only going for diagnosis in 2017. A big part of that was thinking I was not suffering enough and remembering reading Simon Baron Cohen, our favourite developmental psychologist.
Hashtag sarcasm.
Yes, sorry,
For clarity.
big sarcasm flag, saying that you should only get a diagnosis if you were suffering. And I did not feel I was suffering. And there are two parts to that. One, I did not in any way have any insight at that time into the ways in which I was actually suffering or struggling or being challenged, and could have supported myself and had more support had I known. And then the second part is actually the diagnostic models have been based on the idea that one is struggling, suffering, challenged, in deficit. And what is encouraging about new models is a recognition this does not have to be the case at all, actually. But of course, if you're in a medical model, the whole purpose of medical stuff is to treat those who are sick. Well, unless you're in a preventative medical model. Anyway, that's a whole other kettle of fish. You've got headings, Nick, haven't you? What's our first heading around this?
I think particularly around that sort of that medical model, so that diagnostic criteria, even if we're talking about the current diagnostic criteria and not the previous DSM, which, in the timeline that you're talking about, was in existence. And even part of the English NHS diagnostic criteria still say that you have to be significantly affected by those type of criterias for you to receive a diagnosis. And those ideas around, you know, significantly effective is directly related to how much are you suffering? How much are you suffering through lack of relationships? How much are you suffering through unemployment? How much are you suffering through, this, that, and the other, and capitalism? But the diagnostic criteria are absolutely based on autistic people who are in distress, who are in burnout, who are in crisis. And often, that can happen. And I think, when, because that line, isn't it? I used to say I was neurodivergent because I had my dyslexia diagnosis forever ago. Um, and this concept of being autistic, not only was it because I was surrounded by people who very much hit a stereotype, but this idea that I wasn't finding life hard enough, but then I was hitting a burnout every 3 months. And then, that was getting labeled as regularly it was getting labeled as circumstantial depression,
Oh, that's interesting.
which I don't even think is an actual label.
Well, indeed, yeah.
Yeah, circumstantial depression in that sort of that recognition that stuff is hard and you are struggling to cope with it. Um, and that it's fairly reasonable that you are depressed, but I wasn't depressed. I
Mm.
was burnt out and it was autistic burnout. And then I had a big autistic burnout, like, it 5-star autistic burnout at the back of 2019, early 2020. And that was the point where I was like, No, we're not taking the other labels. There is a correct label and I should be seeking it and starting to sort of think about how much I am suffering and what we can do about that.
And it does feel, and actually similarly for me, I mean, I was routinely, I would say, in burnout in the years where I was working intensely in radio and performance, particularly big one in 2013, big one in actually doing my PhD was quite relaxing because I did get a lot of time just
Right.
studying in a room, and by accident that was burnout preventative. But then it was back in the burnout cycle by 2019. Um, but it was it, partly society accepts so much. I'm going to say burnout in all senses as just normal, as routine, doesn't it? That is not even seen as suffering, or as you say, it's labelled
It's
something
it
like
is something else, a circumstantial depression or something. And I agree. I think there is a model now about sort of like, having to push yourself and, how it's quite common in the workplace for people to be burnt out and that it's almost been normalized. But I think we are obviously going to clearly do a separate burnout podcast. But I do think there is a difference between people burning out and autistic burnout fundamentally. But I think that's definitely one for another day. I think this idea around suffering is quite a lot in maybe in validation, maybe in that sort of that idea that it's not that bad. So and so gets on with it. They're out doing whatever. They're working a 60-hour week and I don't know, doing crafts with their children all weekend. I don't know. Like that people are managing and for some reason that you're just not trying hard enough.
yes, and therefore because you're not well, it can't be suffering. It's just a lack in you. So
Mm.
there's a double not recognition, isn't there? You're kind of not recognizing some of the causes of it, and
Mhm.
also, and you're not recognizing it as suffering. I mean, there are lots of ways to break, aren't there? And some of them are more obvious
Than
than others, really. And a lot of us just, and partly this is gendered, not fully, but that there is that kind of gendered thing of women, more often oh, I can do it all. I can juggle my family, my job, my
Mhm.
hobbies, my self-care, even my self-care weirdly can become part of the things that you are supposed to do in order to make yourself well. It's like I've done yoga 4 times this week. I'm Pilates and everything.
Mm.
So I'm on it. I'm totally
Have
on
you?
top of it. God no. Although actually, interestingly, I have started going to once a week. It's really good. a yoga class run by an autistic, recently diagnosed yogi who makes it a really neurodivergent friendly class. And we get to kind of move out. It's really slow and gentle. And there's lots of, we're going to talk about accommodations in another podcast, actually. So I was going to say, but that lots of accommodations. There is something in, and he said, in our last session, so I've only been to 2, but I think it's going to be a thing for me because I can tell I know it is genuinely. It's not good for me in the sense of, like, I used to go to step classes in the late 90s and be like, go and do the step, wear your full body leotard. He actually said something like, when we did a movement the other day,
Mm,
you know, don't grade yourself on how quickly you can do this movement or how well you can do it. That is
mm,
not what we're doing here. In fact, give yourself extra points for if you do it really slowly. So he's trying to counter in his work and in that particular type of self-care practice the sort of faster, more that is in
yeah.
other self-care practices and in society generally. So that, I mean, these things are a huge backdrop, aren't they? To you're not, I'm not suffering enough. Um,
And how much should we be suffering? Like, where's the line? Do you know what I mean? Where is the line? What is the point where you decide that you are suffering more than someone else? And should it be even a comparison? Do you know what I mean? There's this model where you are comparing yourself to other people. If you're thinking about yourself, you're considering yourself within terms like, lazy or not trying hard enough or I'm not good enough. Um, do you get to the point where you're like, I am not good enough for a diagnosis? There's all sorts there. I'm not autistic enough. I'm not autistic enough to be diagnosed. And it's not true.
it's not true, and yet it's one of the most common narratives, isn't it? For those of us who were late diagnosed, it was, it was definitely my narrative, and I kind of had these kind of earlier diagnosed autistic people going, no, yeah, this is one of the things you think, but it's not true. And I'm now, I've got 3 or 4 people at the moment who are in the pre-diagnosis stage. In
Mm,
fact, but they're saying, oh, I'm not, no, I'm not autistic enough. And that does mean, usually that exactly means I am not suffering enough. I fit in too much. I mask too well. I'm okay. Um,
yeah. And this is the thing, like this concept that you can be a little bit autistic. That it's not true. You are or you aren't. I have this phrase. I'm going to name a vegetable now, and I feel like it's going to be the wrong one. I think we're 36% cabbage in we're sort of we're DNA. We share 36% of our DNA with. I'm going with cabbages. The pressure. I feel like I might be wrong, but either way, we're not coleslaw. So we're not 36% Sunday vegetable, you know?
no.
It's just not how it is.
It's not how it is. And I don't really want to confuse our already quite confused vegetable or fruit facts by saying, I thought actually it's that we in fact share 99% of our DNA with banana. And the whole point is organic life is in fact, it's kind of life. And then there are just little bits that make it specifically human life. And actually that's the opposite of what we're conveying, in fact, because we are talking here about, even though, as Lorna Wing, who came up with the concept of the autistic spectrum, said, she said, nature never makes a line without smudging it. So there is smudginess, which is why I suppose spectrum felt okay at one time as a concept. But that's a spectrum of, it was actually a spectrum of autistic traits anyway, not a spectrum of, and that's the common misunderstanding, isn't it? People then go, we're all on the spectrum. No, very strongly. No,
No.
no,
And
we're really
also
not.
this idea that it's a line from, good to bad,
Yeah,
severe to mild, it's simply not. And it serves no one to think about human beings as a series of deficits. Other people aren't framed like that. Like, when I often train professionals, I often sit them down and go, "So, how many people have their, the number of points on their license on their LinkedIn?"
Oh,
Because you don't frame yourself like that. You don't frame yourself as your worst moments. You don't frame yourself as, those times where things have gone wrong. You don't live your life through that lens, and you certainly don't write it down and make it public. But that is what we do to autistic people.
yes. Oh gosh, that's powerful. Also partly viscerally powerful because I'm traumatized thinking about the points on my license, but that's a whole other thing. Um, Gosh, yeah. Well, and therefore, it's no wonder that people that's another reason that people resist a diagnosis. That's another reason why I shout very publicly about my diagnosis, even in contexts where I know that people do not yet understand. They don't when you're presenting pick of the week on Radio 4, it's just a bit confusing and a distraction, but very important nonetheless in my eyes to say it. But gosh, yeah, that gets me. I mean, so essentially at the moment, still, um, in saying I'm autistic, we are also saying, although we're not, because we're doing another thing I was going to say, as in you and I in presenting this podcast. But effectively, given that how the diagnostic criteria are, it is waving a flag going, oh, and I struggle with this.
Yeah, and I think there's a vulnerability to that as well, isn't there?
Yes.
And nobody likes feeling vulnerable. Um, but I think, those of us who are open and have the supports in place and are very ready to be very openly autistic and, in my work and in life, and I think that there is a lot of good in, I mean, we talk about that in all sorts of intersectionalities of being somebody seeing you, like somebody seeing you and thinking, "Oh, they look like me." And then they, oh, because I think, I think everyone has an idea of sort of what autistic people look like in their head, and it's often based on who you've met or what you've seen on social media or, TV. We are not all Sheldon Cooper, um, or Rain Man, or there's a list, isn't there? Um, and we're not. And then if you think that's what autism looks like, and then you look in a mirror and you don't see that, you're going to think that you're not. And then if you pile sort of concepts around quite regularly, and I do think we're slightly moving away from it very, very slowly. Um, but autistic people in and on the media are often seen as suffering.
Well, that is still generally the only acceptable framing, which is why, and I don't know if this is out of sequence, and for you, dear listener, in however you listen to these podcasts, you may not have heard this, but I talked at length in a previous episode about Christine McGuinness and Tom Rosenthal on the BBC show Pilgrimage when they went on a lovely walk to churches in Wales. And usually Christine's narrative is around her suffering when
Mm.
she talks about it in the media. Um, and Yet there was a conversation film between her and Tom Rosenthal where she basically diagnosed him, which yes, that is a bit dodgy, but
Take
it
note
was
of it.
it was a not suffering conversation. It was about kind of laughing about, oh, and we have to sit at dinner and make eye contact and all that, and oof, we don't want to do that. And they were quite happy, but this was not framed as suffering at all. That is why
Mm.
it's standing out to me as this key milestone moment. Um, there's a much higher profile writer than me that I know well who is asked a lot about her being autistic and is very frustrated that it is still framed persistently as oh, you're autism.
No.
Oh, bless you. And the problems and the challenges. Well, it was, what was it when I did actually do the pick of the week episode where I said that I was autistic and the producer wanted to rewrite a particular sentence to say that I
Were you with autism?
no, it was worse.
Yeah. Oh.
Suffered with
Suffering from, and this is the thing, and it's not that that it is not that long ago in our history where the phrase "suffering from autism," they suffer from autism, you are suffering from autism, I'm suffering from other human beings is what I'm bloody suffering from, but never mind. Um,
Well, and here's a because this is another there's always a paradox, and the paradox is, I think, a lot of the actual suffering of being a late diagnosed autistic person is massively unrecognised by ourselves and others.
mm,
Um, and that is often caused by the mismatches between ourselves and our environment, ourselves and the expectations that we and others load upon us. So yes, actually, there is suffering, but that's a particular or often, not always, but that's misrecognized because especially if we're not managing to have the other type of suffering that is acceptable. Um, and then I also want to say, flipping heck, loads of autistic people are having that sort of suffering nonetheless. Which so I'm thinking, so there's been the case of Fern Foster, really tragic case, 22-year-old woman who was um, had a baby and had the was given the news that the baby was going to be taken away from her, and she did not want that at all. And there was no one with her when she was given that news. There was no support given to her at all. And as she had said she would, she killed herself.
mm,
And there's recently been an inquest into partly into the massive lack of accommodations and recognitions given to her.
yeah,
But at many other points in her life, or at many other points in the life of women like Fern, let's
mm,
say, they're not suffering. They're perfectly okay and fine. And then there is a context, a very specific context where many people suffer. We know that actually the rates of or the level of support given to many vulnerable women or anyone who becomes vulnerable in the circumstance of the really huge life event of having a child,
mm,
we still lack as a society the ability to kind of prevent and preempt the many problems, difficulties, and challenges that can arise. And some of them will be specific to something like a neurodivergence, and many of them will be specific to somebody else's other life factors, really.
yeah.
Um, but
I often
I
sorry.
go,
I
okay,
often wonder if we, as autistic people, through poor interception, through alexithymia, often don't realize how much we are suffering until we hit a burnout, a crisis, some sort of pivotal moment where things can go incredibly wrong very, very quickly. And then that support's not in place. And if we'd realized we were suffering enough before that point that we could have had a diagnosis and we could have had help and we could have had accommodations potentially, I mean, magic ones available. That I often think we don't realize ourselves how much we are suffering until we're really quite deep into it.
that that feels such a hugely important point, doesn't it? Because if you are in a a situation where you're kind of looking around at other people, recognizing something's different, whether that's in your school years and it's kind of coming in conjunction with your parents or carers recognizing that, or teachers, whether it's later on.
Mm,
But then somebody somewhere is concluding, yeah, but you're coping fine. You're doing, I mean, look at your grades at school. Look, you've got friends. You make eye contact. You have a partner. So you'll be fine.
mm,
Oh, well, that's lovely. All right. But fast forward 10 years. Now that person is in the situation perhaps where they have multiple life stressors, for
mhm,
example, the huge, massive life stressor of giving birth.
mhm,
Um, Accommodations are not in place, support is not in place, recognition of what that means for internally for that person and around them is not in place. Well, at this point, they are now extremely suffering, and that suffering could have been prevented. So it's back to, and I know this is a huge thing for people who work in healthcare services, many of them feel. we don't have enough emphasis on preventative.
Yeah.
I was going to say preventative medicine, but it's preventative well-being stuff, isn't
Yeah,
it?
just
Looking
care, isn't it? It's fundamentally it's care.
Yes,
Yeah.
and anticipating, preempting,
Mhm.
looking ahead, and actually there are so many things for those of us with an autistic neurotype, and I think neurotype is a really useful word because we're therefore not saying, "Oh, particular set of social deficits." We're saying, "Well, your neurotype," and it's just like having a sort of health MOT, isn't it? Where you look and go, oh, okay, well, so because of your DNA or background or whatever, you're more vulnerable to liver disease or you're more vulnerable to heart disease. So because you are this age or this background. And similarly, oh, because you're autistic, we know that you're more vulnerable to, perhaps in all sorts of situations, but in pregnancy, since we're using that example, so we're going to make sure we're going to look ahead because you're okay now, but we're going to look ahead because there's some things you in particular will need.
Yeah.
And actually, that was part of my thinking around diagnosis. I'd had, like, for the first time, a few health problems that were not diagnosed. It was just things like my gallbladder apparently had collapsed. I mean, I've never heard anything more about that, so I don't know what my gallbladder's doing. I presume it's just, I don't know,
I know.
lying weird. Exactly. I don't know. But anyway, for a while, it seemed to cause a problem. And I did preempt and think, oh, might be useful, eventually to have a diagnosis so that if I'm ever in healthcare settings, which I know would be really stressful for me, I might be able to ask for the support I need. I was actually doing a bit of preemptive thinking, and perhaps that's what.
And that's it. Waiting to the point where you might consider you are suffering enough is probably that little bit too late down the line. And yeah, before then. I mean, obviously, I'm a huge believer in, early diagnosis and things like that and early understanding. It is a huge aspect of my life. But, there's a huge amount of us well over 20 that were never caught in the first place. Um, and I would absolutely want to validate that they don't need to be suffering
No,
and that potentially you could avoid so many life traumas. Um, but years worth of validation and invalidation over, your sensory needs and your social needs, and it's fine. I find it fine, so it's fine. Um, Gets in your head.
it absolutely does get in your head, doesn't it? And actually, and I think that's why. So for me, it has been necessary to find ways of almost deconditioning around the years that that has been in my head. And so some of that does come from feeling into my neurodivergent identity and therefore being able to connect with fellow neurodivergent people. It's the find your tribe thing, which for those of us who have the privilege to do it, that is amazing.
Mm.
And I'm going tonight actually to first meeting of an autistic women's group that my friend Rachel is starting because she's recognizing it's really important to get people together. And it's like, okay, so I want to go and support that. But then the other thing is, um I don't well, there are many other ways of recognizing the impact of having our suffering invalidated. For me, one of them has helpfully been just meditation, actually, which has taken me in the direction of my Buddhist classes. And although this is, well, I have a theory that Buddha was autistic, but we won't go into that now. I think that might be a whole other podcast. I mean, I do anyway. But the Buddhist view is human life is all about, so they actually use the word suffering, and then people go, I'm not suffering. What do you mean human life is suffering? I've just had an ice cream. I've just watched Baby Reindeer on Netflix. I'm totally chill, me. And Buddhists would go, well, yeah, it's not. We're all dissatisfied. We're all always reaching for the next thing, the next, we have this, we have a craving for something else. So all of life is like balancing on the head of a pin, trying to get to the right point where you're just perfectly happy. And actually, that's never going to happen for anyone. It's clearly it's never going to happen for anyone. The joy is in the process of trying to find the balance, and that is where I think neurodivergent and neurotypical people join together. We're all only trying to find the best way to live and be happy. We're all in the same boat, so it's very strange, it seems to me, to require a certain very specific measurable level of obvious suffering
Suffering.
in order to be understood and recognised. We do say that we like to. I was saying this earlier. It's nice when we quote end with a quote. It's quite satisfying, but I don't know if this is the right quote. But I really want to say Haruki Murakami, the writer, said, "Pain is optional." No, he didn't. Sorry. Pain is inevitable. We all have pain. Suffering is optional. He obviously meant, suffering, what we make of that, how we deal with our uncomfortablenesses involved in being a human. That's the bit that's up for negotiation.
Thanks for tuning in to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws. We're so glad you joined us today to explore the fascinating world of neurodivergence with your hosts, me, Nick King.
And me, Kate Fox. If our conversation sparked a thought, a question, or even a smile, don't keep it to yourself. Drop us a line at hello@neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk or visit our website, neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk, to write in. We'd love to hear from you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, consider leaving us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast platform.
Until next time, keep embracing the unique ways you juggle the chainsaws of life.